This is Fiona Beveridge
and Joe Squires, and you are listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Developing Practice podcast. The theme is empathy in leadership. We are from the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic group here at the University of Liverpool. We are from the staff network. My name is Rachel Stonall. I'm one of the co-hosts today.
And I'm Lydia Redigan. I'm also one of the co-hosts.
And my name is Matt Black. I'm one of the network members.
My name is Sadie Salisu and I'm also a member of the network.
Hello Fiona and Joe. We are really pleased for you to be speaking with us today. We're delighted to speak to you about empathy in leadership, which is a topic that feels more important than ever. Before we get started, would you like to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your backgrounds?
So I'm Fiona Beveridge. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor in the University for Humanities and Social Sciences, and I lead on race equality within the university. In terms of my background, I come from an academic background in law. I joined the university as a junior lecturer a long time ago. And in terms of leadership, I think I've always been someone who just looked at things that could be better round about me, got stuck in fixing things, making suggestions. So that kind of leading from within was where I started developing my leadership skills. But I moved into a head of department role and then the head of school, the deanship role, and then finally the Pro-Vice-Chancellor role over a decade ago now.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Joe Squires. I'm Director of People and Culture. I have been in human resources for 25 years now. Always in higher education. I came to the University of Liverpool in 2022 as Deputy Director of HR. I moved into an interim Director of HR position back in April 24 and secured the role as Permanent Director of People and Culture in June this year.
Thank you very much. So first of all, we'd like to talk today about empathy in leadership, what it looks like, why it matters, and explore how leaders can cultivate this as part of their approaches. Fiona and Joe, could you share some reflections on what empathy in leadership looks like for you?
So for me, there are two sides to empathy in leadership. One is related to emotional intelligence, and it's about having an understanding of what it's like to be on the receiving end of you as a leader, how you come across, what your impact is on other people around you. And the other part of that is having some insight into differences in other people's backgrounds, their culture, their values, their experience of the same institutions and processes. So being aware that that's likely to be different for different groups and individuals.
I'm nodding at everything Fiona's saying. I absolutely share those views. I think as a leader, it's about pausing and taking the time to think about others, almost thinking about how would I feel if I was in that position, but more importantly, inquiring, asking questions of your teams and really listening to what team members are saying about their experience, so that you can take decisions, plan actions based on a variety of different information and experiences to those of your own.
Thank you. And I suppose just thinking, Fiona, you've led the university's race equality portfolio for the past 5 years. Have you found empathy to be an important skill in this area?
Yes, I think it was empathy that caused me to hesitate in the first place about whether I was well equipped to step into that space. And it certainly proved to be really important in the role to make sure that I'm making time and opportunity to listen to others. And in fact, the way I've come to think about my role in that space is very much as a facilitator. I can't seek to represent or speak for people from ethnic minority backgrounds, but what I can do is try to ensure that there's space for their views to come through, and then take on the role of amplifying the views and opinions and stories that I hear.
Thank you. And I think that really leads on to perhaps the next part of the question is, how would you state we lead with empathy? How do you feel we can lead with empathy if you're giving advice to others? Perhaps Jo, would you like to answer that one?
I think it is about taking time to listen and to consider. I think those are two really important elements. I think in the fast-paced world that we find ourselves in, it's too easy to speed ahead, to look for a solution, when often time taken to explore issues a little more fully could be helpful. And I think that takes some practice, and in urgent or fast moving pieces of work, that's sometimes easy to forget.
If I can just add to that, I think there's also something about needing to understand both the objective facts of a situation and the way that people are feeling about it as two separate parts of the equation. So quite often when we're being pushed to make decisions in a situation, we think very much about establishing the facts. So what's the story here? What's actually happened? But taking a bit of extra time to think about, well, how is this impacting people? How are they feeling about it? How are they going to feel if we decide to do this or decide to do that, is also a really important part of the equation.
Thank you very much. So moving on to our next question. Empathy is especially important in crisis responses, and we have seen institutional responses to various situations. For example, this summer marked 1 year since the awful attack in Southport and the racialised violence and riots that broke out in the days and weeks after. Could you talk us through some of the discussions behind the scenes that prompted a decision to release an initial statement?
Yeah, and I think this is a situation that absolutely was very fast moving, with a lot of different pieces of information emerging quite quickly, but from different avenues. So, for example, Liverpool City Council were one of the key points of information sharing for us as an institution, but also we were hearing from our managers, some of our staff, and some of our directors about questions that were being raised. We quickly came together as a small group of key stakeholders, I would say, but it was a small group to begin with, including with our communications colleagues. And our focus whenever there is some sort of incident or issue is to think first and foremost about our duty of care to our staff and our students, and to think about our need to maintain a safe and welcoming space on campus for all of the users of campus. And it was with that approach that we started to think about what do we need to communicate and how should we communicate. It was an institutional level communication in the first instance, which really bore those things in mind. So duty of care to staff and students and campus safety.
Yes, I think that's right. I was actually on leave at the time, but observing a little bit of the conversation because some of it was playing out on emails, and I could see that on the one hand there were various people contacting me, for example, in my role, saying we need to get some communications out. People are feeling very upset and disturbed, and a lot of people are feeling very impacted by this. But on the other hand, we were kind of locked in as an institution to moving in time with other institutions. So, for example, there was quite a long delay before the city communications cell permitted us to say anything and gave the go-ahead for messages to go out. And there was also a desire to try to contextualise what was happening in Liverpool with what was happening in other parts of the country and be understanding what other universities were saying and what other institutions were seeing as a way of sense checking. So I could see those things playing out, and there was a bit of a tension between a demand to get an urgent message out and a need to try to be really sure about what we were saying and how it was playing out.
Thank you. And I suppose that perhaps idea of trying to balance urgency with sensitivity. So how would you see the role of empathy regarding that complexity, really?
Well, I think there's a fundamental challenge that in a sense what you want to do is stop the clock until you've got a full picture and then communicate. But of course, you can't stop the clock in people's lives. So I think with retrospect, one of the things we would have done was send a holding message to our managers to say we're aware of this and we're working on a message. In the meantime, can you keep us informed? I think one of the things that happened was that a bit of a vacuum opened up because there was no communication, and that therefore meant that some managers in parts of the university kind of felt they had to decide for themselves, for example, to close buildings early, let staff go home, whatever. So I think that's one part of it. And I think the other part of it is, I mean, Joe's already said, we were hearing from some members of staff, but we weren't proactively seeking to find out what members of staff were experiencing and thinking. And I think when we reviewed what had happened during this period, we identified that as a key lesson to be learned.
Thank you, Jo.
Yeah, I would echo. So naturally what happens when you have a void is people do start to fill that with their own decisions for the best of their areas. So we didn't doubt why people were making these decisions, but as Fiona said, looking back, had we shared some sort of statement which explained that we were giving full consideration to this matter and we would subsequently be in touch, and even to invite feedback through an appropriate channel, I think that would have helped us more fully consider the situation from many different perspectives to the ones that we were hearing about, because clearly what then transpired as we began to hear from the network particularly was that there was a whole conversation going on that we were unaware of because we haven't opened up for that feedback to come through.
Thank you, and I think that leads really nicely on to the next question.
Yeah, thanks Rachel. Hi Fiona and Jo. I think it's really interesting to hear your side of things and what was going on behind the scenes for you guys. To provide some context for what was happening for us as network members, we found that a lot of the network, ourselves included, were particularly distressed during this time. It was quite a difficult time as we were grappling with the shock of what had happened in Southport, but also what was happening, as Fiona mentioned, on our doorstep, what was happening in Liverpool and how we could contextualise that, because there was lots of questions from our members about their own safety, seeing violence, things being shared on social media, things being spray painted around the city. So I think what began to happen really quickly for us as network members in a committee is that we felt we had to put on almost like an emergency meeting. So we had this drive from our members to feel that we needed to help have a conversation where everyone felt safe and in a safe space to be able to have this emergency meeting. So as the network committee, we felt we had to take on a role of almost advocacy to feed that back up. And so we were driven by empathy to do that. And I think what we felt through that experience was we are leaders in the network, but we're not professionals in that role. So we're just really interested in finding out from your perspective how we can bridge the gap between empathy and leadership, particularly in these institutional decisions versus local actions. And I guess, Jo, I just wanted to highlight for yourself, you mentioned something before about voids and how decisions got made in those voids, and I think that was really interesting, because one of the things that we've talked a little bit about in the network is about how we want to create an environment at the university where staff and leaders are comfortable to hold risk. And I think some staff felt comfortable to hold that risk to make decisions based on the welfare of their staff at that time, and then others didn't. And that's what I felt came out of that void. Could you comment on that a little bit further, please?
I think I would agree with that observation. And I think, yes, some managers and leaders were more comfortable in taking a position and holding that position. Others were perhaps looking for more direction in terms of the steps they should take. I think we can address that moving forward. As Fiona and I have said, we have reviewed our position and how we deal with matters like this, and I think we can address that by ensuring that there isn't such a void in the future, and people understand what to expect from a university voice, and therefore where they can be comfortable in making local decisions, because local decisions always have to be made. But it's the coordination around that, the framework that we put around that to allow people to make fair and consistent decisions that I think is really important to get right moving forward. You also talked about the network and the leadership that you play within the network and how we bridge some of those gaps. And I know that we spoke about that when we attended one of the network meetings shortly after the initial period of communications that we had. And again, I think hopefully what that demonstrated was that SLT members are willing and keen to have conversations, but I think what is important is that we don't just have conversations when something has happened, that we keep the space, the invite, the discussion as a more regular part of our university interaction with our staff and our networks throughout the year.
I think that's really interesting, Jo, because what we reflected on was that need for balance. Because what we felt is when a topic may come up that affects the network, we feel a lot of pressure from our network, and we feel that, you know, that empathy, that overwhelming sense of empathy with the network to be able to want to represent them. But also we feel that this role as network leadership and a network committee is voluntary, and it's on top of our day job, and we struggle with that. We talk about it quite a lot, don't we? We struggle with that. So I think that's one thing that came out of that experience, was to reflect on, well, what does that balance and that appropriate communication look like? So Fiona and Jo, from that experience, what lessons do you think were learned?
For me, I think the first lesson is that you do need to be proactive in finding out what people are experiencing and also what people know. Because one of the issues here is that different people know different things. And if you're not hearing from all quarters of the university and from outside the university and sharing what you're hearing, in the first place, you're not even sharing basic information and testing what people know. But the other thing that you're not gaining and sharing is what people are experiencing and what they're worrying about, what their concerns are, and therefore what your communication has to address if it's going to be effective. So I think that is something we've thought about a lot and taken very seriously, that our first response in a crisis should be to really think about, who's on the sharp end of this, what's happening there, how can we find out, who should we be talking to, and all of that before we actually shape the communication. And we've talked about, for example, also sharing draft communications to ensure that we are really addressing concerns. And I think that played out in a very, very visible way here. So the first communication that went out, and you'll remember this, talked about the riots in the city, but it didn't name racially motivated violence as such.
Yeah.
And that left a lot of members of our community. We then heard a lot of stories then, when we met with the network and network members, about how that left people feeling that what they were experiencing had not been noticed and was not being acknowledged. The second communication that we sent, Joe sent actually to managers a week later, was really, really clear in calling that out, being really clear that what was being seen was racial violence. And the critical difference is this, I think, that if you say there's a riot in the city, then, that riot stops and people think the problem's solved and there's nothing to worry about anymore. If you say there's racial violence in the city, well, clearly that doesn't stop. Those race riots gave a license to racism that continued and carried on, really impacting on people's lives. So that was one of the things that the subsequent communication did. And the other thing that Joe was very, very clear about to managers in that second communication was that they should be proactive in reaching out to their staff, in understanding that they may well be impacted by this in a variety of different ways, and that could have ongoing consequences and into the future for their ability to be fully present at work, because they were dealing with things in their personal lives, because there was obviously a lot of emotion involved in that. So that much more empathetic kind of response was highlighted in that second message. And then the kind of public safety, staff and student wellbeing messages, the signposting to support, was still in there but further down. So we'd completely kind of reversed approach from the first message to the second message. And I think that second message that Joe sent was a really good model of empathetic leadership and a model for what we should do in future in incidents like this.
I just wanted to ask, how do you encourage proactive leadership?
I think you have to start from the top. You have to make it clear that it's an expectation. When you're talking to leaders and managers in your area of the university, and there are many different ways to convey this. You can try to understand what people's actual management practice looks like in terms of their diary, saying you have an open door, as I think you said earlier, it doesn't quite get there, does it? Understanding how people are actually spending their time. So asking questions in a kind of coaching way about, so what do you think your staff think, about that? What concerns have been raised in your area? You kind of convey the expectation that you expect the managers and the leaders to be out having these conversations and to be able to answer that question, rather than them supposing that they know the answer.
I just wanted to add a point about empathy and leadership, because from my perspective, I didn't have a clue what the network was. So I found out about the network, suddenly last minute, got an email to say there's an emergency meeting. But I just wanted to touch on the point that empathy is an emotion, and emotion is supposed to move you to take action. So it was really inspiring for me to see that, empathy came through from the network. You guys stood up, and also the meeting that was held with the SLT, that was also a good example of that.
Fiona, you mentioned about the difference between email 1 and email 2 and email 2 that Joe got to send. So you mentioned before a little bit about how the first email was very much us trying to figure out what was happening in the city, other communications from other organisations. You know, as a staff member of the university, there were many times during this where I felt like it was almost like a snow day. We were waiting for what was the council saying, can we close, can we open? So I guess I'm interested, Joe, what happened between email 1 and email 2 for you to completely be able to reverse that approach? Now, we've touched on it a little bit on what Fiona said, but from a kind of operational and a very tangible way, what felt like it changed for you?
I think it was the feedback that we were getting, that you were gathering through the network, and in discussions with members of our diversity and inclusion team, and the variety of experiences that were being voiced through that feedback really helped us, and as a group of university leaders, just understand that people were experiencing this in very different ways.
Yeah.
Which then helped inform the content of that communication, which, as Fiona said, was more about managers, please talk to your members of staff to understand what they're experiencing and how this is impacting on them, if indeed it is, and to what extent. What's always difficult when you think about any kind of people-related policies is that no one situation is the same, and people do not experience things in the same way, and that makes it difficult for managers to always interpret policies and apply them to people. But I think what we aimed to do in that second communication was almost to say it's okay to do things differently for people who are experiencing things in a different way. That's fine. It's not against any particular policy. We're humans, and on that basis we need tailored solutions rather than off the pages of a policy kind of
Absolutely,
solution.
Joe. I think it's really interesting because it goes back to the point about being able to give leaders and managers the opportunity to hold risk so that they can make these decisions. And I think that goes back to Matt's point about proactive leadership as well. So I've just got one more question for you. Leadership development often focuses on achieving outcomes. How can we inspire current and new leaders to seek opportunities and grow empathy within their leadership approach?
I'll take this question first,
Thanks,
given that my area includes the academy, so our development team. Listeners and you may have seen, we have a leadership commitment framework which really articulates what it means to be a leader in the University of Liverpool, and it's got 4 main pillars which focus on being a credible leader, an ambassadorial leader, an inclusive leader, and an impactful leader. And underpinning all of those pillars is about effective communication and networking. All of the development associated with leadership that the Academy run is based on this leadership commitment framework. And I guess the empathy part of this really comes in the pillar that focuses on inclusive leadership. It's really important, Fiona referred to it earlier, that we think more about a coaching approach in the way we engage with individual team members and our regular conversations with them, and that we really listen. And I think that's what our development now focuses on, rather than some of the more traditional nuts and bolts type managerial skills that we might have expected 10, 15 years ago.
So could it be argued then, Joe, that that approach with communication and embedding that in a leadership framework has come from situations like this? So that learning, that good practice is being put into how we want to shape leaders at the University of Liverpool.
So I wasn't around when the leadership commitment framework was developed. I don't know if you were, Fiona.
Yeah, and actually it's come from future leaders in successive cohorts who've gone through programs in the academy.
Oh, fantastic.
So they've been asked to think about what they would identify as good leadership, and then break that down. And genuinely successive cohorts have shaped what has gone into these pillars and the overall shape of this leadership commitment. And it's a work in progress. I think it gets tweaked almost annually to reflect the views of new cohorts going through those programs.
And so I completed the PG DAP 2024, so I was part of that process of discussing the pillars, and it definitely has helped me considering my role within my team, and also considering how there are different perspectives of being a leader and expressing that to other people as well.
Oh, interesting. Thanks, Rachel. Fiona, we know that you've got an interesting concept around stretch. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about it.
You're referring to something that I talked to a leadership group about fairly recently within the university. I think it's really important that leaders continue with their own personal development and continue to grow and challenge themselves to do new things. And so the idea of stretch is something we often talk about in relation to students, but I think it's something we need to talk about in relation to our leaders as well. I think it's come from reflection on my own career. You'll know that I'm retiring soon, and I've been thinking back about some of the things that have been most meaningful to me and that have most contributed to my development. And my reflection has been that sometimes it's when you really challenge yourself, for example, taking on a new role that seems like a stretch from where you are, or having to deal with a problem that is really, really challenging to you. You don't know what the answer is. I think when I gave that presentation, I also reflected on the way that senior leadership teams in this organisation, but in many organisations, had to completely rethink how they worked through COVID as well, where there wasn't clear guidance, there wasn't clear evidence about what was going to happen next, and the idea of just navigating by the stars, really, because everything else has disappeared. So I think so for me that was an encouragement to people to not hold back from accepting challenges or trying to deal with challenges because they're unfamiliar or because you don't kind of know the answer, you can't see the answer yet. For me, if you always think about values and purpose, you will be able to feel your way through, and this is maybe the important point, as well as anybody can. So it's having a bit of trust in yourself as well, that if you're well motivated and you stop to reflect, you ask other people for advice and guidance, you look to see how others might resolve the problem, then you'll find a way through. So it's putting yourself in those situations where you'll be stretched. And you asked me earlier about the role I've had in leading on race equality in the institution, and that's definitely one where when I did think about it, I recognised that it would be a stretch for me in the best sense, that I would have to really think consciously and carefully about how to undertake that role. But actually it's been really rewarding for me to do that.
So Fiona, we talked before about how culture is set by the leadership, and that's really important. But also what we wanted to be able to do was think about how leadership is a skill for everyone, and that's a skill for everyone to learn. So how would you empower colleagues of all levels to show empathetic leadership?
I talked about how my own leadership journey started, as many academic journeys start by undertaking roles within the department and just seeking to make things better for my colleagues and for the students around. And I think that's quite a common experience. I think everybody can lead from the middle in that sense, just being that person, thinking about the impact they have in their team, thinking about, from an empathetic perspective, what it's like to have me in your team rather than having you in my team. So how do other people experience you at work, and what can you do? You know, what would they say about you in terms of how you make it better? And everybody can make it better for colleagues on some level.
Thanks, Fiona. And Sadie, I wonder from the network perspective, so you joined the network during the race riots last year. How has this changed your approach to leadership in your role and in both your day job and as part of the network now?
Yeah, so I think it was sort of a baptism by fire, but I think it was a really good opportunity that the network did create that space. And so I was just going to add that, you know, leadership should be responsible for setting a good example, but also to colleagues that might not be in leadership, I think there's a good chance for you to be proactive and step forward when the time arises.
So finally, this podcast is called the Developing Practice Podcast. We like to finish each podcast with 3 or 4 take-home tips that the listeners could reflect on in terms of their own personal practice. If you could give us a few tips or thoughts to reflect on in relation to empathy, what would they be?
So I would suggest that for not just leaders, but anyone listening to the podcast, to actually take a look at the leadership commitment framework, especially if they haven't done so recently, and think about, as we've just been talking about, leadership can be at any level and can be of yourself as well, but really to test, where do I fit with the statements in here, which, as Fiona explained, came from staff and colleagues. Give some thought to, has your attention become diverted from any area because of the fast-moving pace of the work environment, and actually do you need to course correct in terms of your style, your approach, or do you have areas that you think, actually, I think I need to develop there? And take a look on the Academy website, because I'm sure that there is something that would fit the gap that you may feel you've identified. And then more broadly, I guess, in terms of all staff, to really kind of think about how well do we listen to each other and take the opportunity to understand a team member's point of view, a team member's perspective, and take that opportunity to listen to different perspectives to inform our own practice, our decisions, our action plans. One of the things that's kept coming into my mind as we've been having this conversation today is that as leaders, as members of staff, we are part of a vast community of experiences and expertise at the university. And I think all too often we can feel as though we are on our own and having to deal with an issue, a challenge, and sometimes it feels like that could be insurmountable, but actually there are many of us and we can draw on each other, as Fiona said in some of what she's been talking about. We can draw on each other and our own experiences to help shape a collective way forward. And I think we probably just need to remind ourselves of that more often, to engage with others more as a part of our regular way of working.
Thanks, Jo, that's brilliant. Fiona, do you have any tips?
Yes, don't want to repeat myself, but I think it's probably come across that I think leadership starts at home and often informally, that it's often about what you do within your own team and the immediate area that you work, and it's built on a developing self-awareness of what you bring or add to a team. Thinking about empathetic leadership, I'd also just pick up on something you said, Lydia, which is that empathetic leadership is about the culture of an organisation, and it's about having a culture that values individuals as whole people, including their emotional life and their personal circumstances, and including those in your consideration of actions on a daily basis. So I would say empathetic leadership is for every day, not just for the crisis situations.
I'm really interested in, we touched on the point about feeling a little bit overwhelmed. So during that time, we felt we were witnessing those events, we were considering our own safety, and we were hearing the concerns of our network members. And one thing that I've learned through that process, or felt or recognised, through that process, was that I felt it was very difficult to be in that space when you're personally affected by what's happening around you. And I felt exhausted on top of it. And I guess as leaders with significant experience and long careers with different crises that have come, I'm sure, over your careers, what advice would you give to perhaps someone who's early on in their leadership journey about how to manage those things, especially when it gets really personal in a professional setting?
So I think this goes back partly to my point about we're not on our own as leaders, and there are other sources of support and advice that can be drawn on. I think possibly what we have to do, though, in our university is make clearer some of those sources of support and advice that you could have drawn on during that time. Because, as you say, you were hearing about other experiences and you were going through that yourself. And so I think what we would say is we haven't got all of these things perfect right now. There is still work and learnings that we need to do. And we will keep taking that forward. But fundamentally, and going back to, you asked about, the experiences that we'd had, that I've had over the course of my career, it is about drawing on other sources of support and not letting everything land on your shoulders. There's also a difficult acceptance as a leader that you cannot solve everything for everyone. Mm-hmm. And that is difficult when you can see people going through really awful and horrendous situations. But again, I think that's where sources of support for yourself as a leader is critical in that circumstance.
I think from last year I learned a lot about myself as a person very early in their leadership journey. I asked for a lot of help. I really had to sort of lean on other people who have been in the same situation or been in similar situations who were similar levels, and ask for help, and that really helped to kind of navigate all those decisions I felt like I had to make, and also reassure me that I was actually making the right decisions. So, I mean, I'll definitely take away a lot of things from this session today, but last year, asking for help really made a difference.
I think that's really important to hear from someone like yourself, Joe, in your position, because I think it needs, for me at that time, I think I needed permission to be able to go away and give myself time to breathe too. What I felt was very surreal about the whole experience for me is that we were living through it, and I was sitting at the table with, everyone from so many different backgrounds in that senior leadership meeting, and then going back to my house in Toxteth, which was a very different world from where it was, when we were having those meetings. And I think that was difficult because imposter syndrome feeds into that too, and so it's difficult to give yourself those breaks and ask for help and to do those things when you have a part of that in you too. So I think it's really interesting and brilliant to hear that from you, Jo, so thanks so much for sharing that.
I think we have some learning to do as an organisation, and some of the things that happened last summer point to our need for stronger business continuity and crisis management resources and routines and kind of how to knowledge within the organisation, and we've reflected on that. But if you think about how other organisations would organise themselves around a major public incident or a kind of crisis within the organisation, regularly enabling staff to debrief on what they were dealing with, but also making sure that people were having breaks from dealing with the situation would be completely normal. But I think we were kind of leaving it to people to take those decisions for themselves, whether to debrief, and if so, how and who to, and also whether to have some downtime, time away, just to refresh and recharge the batteries. And I think that's something we just need to think about and make sure that we do understand what our plan is.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Jo. What a brilliant conversation.
Really, really great to hear and get some insight, and also from our network members as well, feeding into the conversation. Okay, so many thanks, Jo and Fiona. Some really interesting conversations and some great takeaway points. So I'd like to take opportunity to thank all our contributors today, so including our members from the staff network and also people who've provided support prior to today's podcast, which includes Karishma, Alison and Mike as well. So many thanks everybody for today, and I hope the listeners can really take away some interesting and thought-provoking points.